So Inside Out 2 has now officially reached the $1 billion club, which is absolutely incredible, and it is the sequel to one of my favourite movies ever made. And I cannot believe it's been almost 10 years since that absolute masterpiece came out. But as far as the film world is concerned, this is set 2 years after that first brilliant movie. And it is really, really enjoyable. And I love the underlying message of the fact that you need both positive and quote-unquote negative emotions in order to deal with later life. And it definitely did have some awesome moments in there. For example, anxiety taking over a person's mind, which is so relatable. This potentially spiraling out of control when somebody's anxiety gets the better of them, and this potentially leading into a panic attack. But also what I do think is interesting is that a little bit of what scientists call eustress, which is useful stress, and a little bit of anxiety-driven behavior towards this can actually be beneficial, but when it gets into overdrive, that's really where you need to be super careful. All of the voice acting was absolutely brilliant. I loved the visual personification and realization of a brainstorm. I thought that was so clever from a visual representation perspective. And then what is your true inner self? And is this driven by a positive emotion? Is this driven by a negative emotion? Or actually, is it a combination of everything, and all of a person's life experiences definitely does create their inner sense of self? But for me, I just feel like the outside storyline of Riley trying to make the hockey team just wasn't that relatable. And I just felt like the original plan for Riley's high school storyline was her trying to be part of the school talent show. And even though not everybody would have participated in a talent show, I feel like that's a little bit more accessible and a little bit more relatable for all of the experiences that I can no doubt imagine that she would have had to go through. For example, stage fright and just maybe questioning whether or not you can do what you need to do. Do you actually have any talent inside of yourself? I think it could have just posed some really interesting questions, as well as creating a really competitive environment, which could have been so good. And I also think from an imagination perspective and from a fantastical moments perspective as well, the first movie was just vastly superior, and I was kind of expecting a little bit more in that vein from this movie. And I do like the thought, no pun intended, of throwing bad memories and experiences to the back of your mind and forgetting all about them, and then what can potentially happen when they suddenly flood your mind. And like I said, your sense of self is more stronger when it's formed both of positive and negative experiences. I do feel like this movie, to an extent, is a little bit overhyped, because I was just expecting so much more from it. But it is still really, really enjoyable, and I think the formation of this movie is really interesting, as they spoke to a clinical psychologist in terms of, is this really how positive and negative emotions work, and also about puberty, and the console was overreacting to any emotion, which I thought was really, really clever. They also involved kids in terms of what the real high school experience is like, and actually it was their idea to have nostalgia in there, which I thought was really, really funny, as obviously high school kids are so young, so you wouldn't think that they're being really nostalgic. And I thought they wrote that into the film quite well in terms of, no, we don't need you yet nostalgia. Guilt and shame were also going to be other characters that were going to be part of Riley's mind, but then they dropped guilt and they kind of incorporated guilt into the anxiety character, and they just thought that shame isn't really an emotion. But what I did like is that actually there are loads of lessons to be learned in the same way as the first movie. For example, seeing the benefit of actually having sadness inside one's mind, as well as having negative emotions in there too. Speaking of the characters, let's go through all of the main ones now. So I think Joy Amy Poehler just brings her to life in such a good way, and I love her unstoppable positivity, which is just so infectious. And I do feel like a lot of people can learn and resonate with this in terms of, you know, positivity will help you get over so many things, and sometimes it can actually be a person's secret weapon. And I do love how in every person's mind they have got a different core emotion, and I feel like positive people can definitely relate to the fact that they are driven by a lot of positive emotion. And I did think it was interesting to see what happens when a character like Joy is actually pushed to the edge. And I do actually feel like it could have been interesting to explore that a little bit more. And on that point, I do feel like Inside Out 2 does slightly skew a little bit more towards a younger audience, whereas I feel like the first Inside Out did such a good job in terms of catering to a wider all ages audience. And I think the characterization of anxiety was an absolutely genius move to make. I think Maya Hawke brings her to life in such a good way. And I love how she's just got so much relentless energy, And she just does it in such a cute package. But I do think it's really important to explore what actually happens when somebody does go into anxiety overdrive and anxiety does take over people, which I feel like is such a relatable experience. I have to say, surprisingly, sadness is such a scene stealer, and I feel like Phyllis Smith just brings her to life so well. I just feel like from a voice perspective alone, the way in which sadness is just suddenly just such a draining character, suddenly bursting into sadness, such a funny character, and a really important character. I do feel like people do feel really, really sad inside, but sometimes people don't even recognize and see this. Whereas actually, like I said, I feel like sadness is also a really relatable emotion. Disgust wasn't that useful, and fear was super sidelined in this movie. And to some extent, I do agree with what Jeremy John said actually, that fear can be an extension into anxiety, but it's interesting that they chose to separate the two of them. Anger was fine, but similarly didn't get to do that much. Envy was really, really funny. Definitely anxieties that was second in command. And I thought it was really interesting seeing these two quote-unquote negative emotions literally ruling Riley and potentially giving her a bit of a new personality. And I thought the personification of boring was unfortunately really boring, and they could have just given that character so much more to do as well. So whilst I feel like Inside Out 2 no doubt has some incredible ideas in there, I do actually feel like this movie is a little bit overhyped. And even though it has joined the $1 billion club, which I think is really, really brilliant, and I think it has opened up and started a lot of emotion-led conversations, especially what can happen when anxiety takes over a person, and hopefully will avoid future panic attacks. And so from that perspective, I think it's absolutely brilliant. But for me, I just wish that it would have pushed the envelope a little bit further. And so for all of those reasons, I'm going to give Inside Out 2 a solid 6.5 out of 10. Now I'd love to hear from you. What did you think of this film? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.